Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. This is our first video on the sensory or the ascending spinal pathways. Now, as part of this video, we will discuss the hierarchical arrangement of neurons within the sensory pathways, including the first order, second order, and the third order neurons. We'll talk about the type of the sensory information which is carried by the three major sensory tracts, which include the dorsal column, the spinothalamic pathway, and the spinocerebellar pathways. And then we'll talk about the location of the first order neuronal cell bodies and the sensory tracts within the section of the spinal cord. Now, before we embark upon talking about the sensory spinal pathways, there are some basic principles which we need to understand. Almost all the sensory pathways, they comprise of neurons which are arranged in a hierarchical fashion. So we've got a first order neuron, we've got a second order neuron, and we've got a third order neuron in almost all sensory pathways which we are going to talk about. So let's just highlight these first, second, and third order neurons. So for that, how about if we actually have a look at this schematic over here? This schematic basically represents the central nervous system. So you can see the spinal cord shown over here, followed by the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brainstem. That is followed by the thalamus, which is the sensory relay station for almost all sensory information. And then we've got the higher order cognitive processing center over here, which is our cerebral cortex. Now, the first order neurons, where are they situated? Well, the first order neurons, they have their cell bodies situated within the dorsal root ganglion. So that means the first order neurons and their cell bodies are going to be inside the peripheral nervous system, not inside the central nervous system. However, their axons are then going to enter into the central nervous system, where they bring in the sensory information from the peripheral receptor into the CNS, and they synapse with the cell body of the second order neuron. Now, the second order neurons are situated inside the central nervous system. Their cell bodies and their axons and dendrites are situated within the central nervous system. The position of the second order neuron might be variable based on the type of the sensory tract which we are talking about. But one thing which is the hallmark of almost all the second order neurons is that they are going to cross at certain point. They're going to cross the midline at certain point inside the central nervous system. This crossing is known as the decussation of the sensory pathway, or in case of a motor pathway, the decussation of the motor pathway. And because of this reason, we see that our right side of the brain is linked with controlling the left side of the body, and the left side is linked with the left side of the brain is linked with controlling the right side of the body in most of the cases. The second order neurons, in case of sensory pathways, they are going to then project to the thalamus, where the cell body of the third order neuron is present. Thalamus is our sensory relay station for almost all sensory information, with the exception of one, which is the sense of smell. So all the sensory pathways, the second order neurons, are going to project onto the cell bodies inside the thalamus. Now, inside the thalamus, the second order neurons, they synapse with the cell bodies of the third order neurons. So the third order neuronal cell bodies are therefore situated inside the thalamus. From here, the axons of the third order neurons are then going to project to the higher order cognitive processing center, which is the cerebral cortex. Now let's begin by talking about the first order neurons. Now the good thing is that irrespective of the type of the sensory pathway which we are going to discuss, the first order neurons of almost all the sensory pathways is situated inside the peripheral nervous system. And the cell bodies of these first order neurons are going to be situated within the dorsal root ganglion. Hence, we can discuss the first order neurons of almost all the sensory pathways together in general. Now, what you're looking over here is basically a schematic of the transverse section of the spinal cord. What you can see over here is a butterfly-shaped gray matter in the center. We can see that it has a posterior horn to it. It has an anterior or a motor horn to it. The gray matter is then surrounded by the white matter all around it, and the white matter also has got a posterior column, a lateral column, and then an anterior column, which we discussed in detail in our previous video on the spinal cord. Now this X-shaped structure over here, that represents the spinal nerve. You can see that the spinal nerve over here is formed by the union of a posterior root, which is sensory, and a anterior root, which is motor in nature. The two roots combine to form spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve then splits up into a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. The rami and the spinal nerves are mixed structures, so they can contain both sensory as well as motor neurons. However, the roots are always either purely sensory or purely motor. So when we talk about the sensory neurons, especially the first order neurons, they could travel in the posterior or the anterior ramus or in the spinal nerve, but once they reach the level where the roots are present, they're always going to be traveling within the sensory root, not within the anterior root, because the anterior one is purely motor in nature. Now, where is the first order neuron? Well, the first order neuron enters the spinal nerve either through the posterior ramus or through the anterior ramus, bringing in the sensory information from a peripheral receptor. And depending where the receptor is situated, which part of the body the sensory information is being brought in, the first order neuron would be present either in the posterior or in the anterior ramus. So if, let's say, the sensory information is being brought in from the posterior body wall, then the sensory neuron might be traveling through the posterior ramus. However, if the sensory information, let's say, is being brought in by our limbs or the anterior part of the body, then it would be traveling through the anterior ramus. Irrespective of the ramus through which the sensory first order neuron is traveling through, or the dendrites of the sensory first order neurons are traveling through, they will reach the spinal nerve, they will pass through the spinal nerve, but from here onward the first order neuron is going to pass through the posterior root, which is purely sensory. Now, the cell body of the first order neuron is situated inside the dorsal root ganglion, right? Just remember the difference between a ganglion and a nucleus. The ganglion is an accumulation of neuronal cell bodies outside the CNS. So the ganglion, therefore, is a peripheral nervous system structure, and the dorsal root ganglion is the area where the cell bodies of first order neurons are going to be situated. On the contrary, the nuclei are accumulation of the neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system. So when we talk about different cell bodies of second order neurons and third order neurons, we'll be referring to their accumulations as the nuclei, not as a ganglion. Right, so now the first order neuron, the dendrites of those, the axons of those first order neurons are then going to enter into the posterior sensory horn of the spinal cord, and here they will synapse with the accumulation of neuronal cell bodies over here, which are known as the nuclei, which in most of the cases are going to be the nuclei or the cell bodies of the second order neurons. Now, we've already learned in our previous video on the spinal cord anatomy, where we talked about the accumulation of different neuronal cell bodies inside the posterior gray horn and as well as in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And each accumulation of neuronal cell body, each nucleus over here is specialized to receive a specific type of sensory information. Now that we know about the location of the first order neuron and its cell body inside the dorsal root ganglion, let's see how the first order neurons of various sensory pathways bring in the sensory information and which nuclei are they going to pass on this sensory information to. For instance, let's take the example of the sensory information of pain and temperature. These are actually these sensations are perceived by the free nerve endings in the peripheral body, and these are then relayed by the first order neurons into the group of neuronal cell bodies over here, which are known as the substantia gelatinosa. This accumulation of cell bodies, which is known as substantia gelatinosa, is actually the second order neuronal cell bodies of the pain and temperature pathway. Similarly, the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination, these are carried by the first order neurons and are relayed into a group of nuclei over here inside the posterior gray horn, which is known as the substantia propria or the nucleus proprius. The second order neuronal cell bodies for this pathway, however, is not situated over here. The substantia propria does receive a neuronal connection through the first order neurons, which are bringing in the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination and carrying it to the higher brain centers. However, the substantia propria is not the second order neuronal cell body. The second order neuronal cell body for this sensory pathway is going to be situated somewhere higher up in the lower medulla, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Various other second order neuronal cell bodies include the Clark's column over here, which is a nucleus that receives the sensory information of proprioception, which is destined to go over to this, which is then destined to be transmitted to the cerebellum. Lastly, the visceral afferent nucleus in the posterior horn over here, that is linked with receiving the visceral autonomic sensory information. So you can see there are different neuronal cell bodies over here, which are in most of the cases the second order neuronal cell bodies, and they are receiving the sensory information from the first order neurons and and the first order neurons of different sensory pathways, they share a common course, and therefore we discuss the first order neurons together. And from here onwards we can see that the different sensory pathways are kind of separating from each other because they have their own individual separate second order neuronal cell bodies, or the nuclei, which we will discuss separately in detail as we talk about the neuronal pathways separately. Now that we have linked the first order neuron, the type of sensory information they're bringing in with the neuronal cell bodies inside the posterior gray horn. However, how about if we actually take one step further and connect these neuronal cell bodies with the sensory tracts in the spinal cord? Let's begin with the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination once more. Now, this sensory information from the lower half of the body, which means below the T6 spinal cord segment, or below the 6th thoracic spinal cord segment, this sensory information is brought in by this first order neuron into the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. The first order neurons then ascend in the inner half of the dorsal column over here, which is known as fasciculus gracilis and is color coded in red over here. So now we're actually discussing the sensory tracts, or the ascending sensory pathways, which are going to convey this information up to the higher brain centers. While the same sensory information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the upper half of the body above the T6 spinal cord segment, that is going to be brought in through the same into the same sensory horn of the spinal cord. But then from here, this information is going to be transmitted by the first order neuron in the lateral half of the dorsal column, and this is color coded in green over here, and this is known as the fasciculus cuneatus. Next comes the sensory information of proprioception, which is processed at a subconscious level. That means this is the proprioceptive information which is going to the cerebellum. So this sensory information is brought in once again by the first order neuron into the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And we said that the nucleus which receives the sensory information would be the Clark's column. This is the second order neuronal cell body in this pathway. And then this sensory information would then be transmitted into the spinocerebellar pathways, which have been shown over here. See, they've been color coded in pink, and there are two types of spinocerebellar pathways. We've got a posterior spinocerebellar and an anterior spinocerebellar pathway. These pathways, as the name indicates, they are going to then take up the sensory information from the spinal cord into the cerebellum, and hence they've been given the name spinocerebellar pathways. Now, just to let you know that these sensory pathways are situated on both sides of the midline. However, for the sake of simplicity, I've just drawn the sensory pathways on one side over here and the sensory nuclei on this side over here. The spinocerebellar pathways, which are now the second order neurons, they could either cross over the midline and then ascend on the contralateral side, or they could just ascend ipsilaterally, because some of the spinocerebellar pathways do not cross, and we'll talk about those separately when we talk about the spinocerebellar pathways. Lastly, the sensory information regarding pain and temperature, that is once again brought in by the first order neuron into the dorsal gray horn. The second order neuronal cell bodies for this pain and temperature pathway would be situated inside a group of cell bodies over here, which is known as the substantia gelatinosa. From here, the second order neurons are then going to ascend in this gray color coded column over here, which is known as the lateral spinothalamic tract. And the lateral so the second order neurons are going to cross over or decussate, crossing the midline, and then are going to ascend as the lateral spinothalamic tract to the thalamus, which is the sensory relay station for all the sensory information. And the name of the tract kind of tells you that it is going to take up the sensory information from these cell bodies over here in the posterior gray horn into the thalamus higher up, hence called the spinothalamic tracts. Right, so thank you very much for listening to this video. Just to summarize, what we've done in this video is that we've actually talked about some basic principles which you have to know in terms of the hierarchical arrangement of the sensory pathways before we begin discussing these sensory pathways individually and in much more detail. We talked about different types of sensory information which can come into the spinal cord. However, Irrespective of the type of sensory information which we bring into the spinal cord, the good thing is that all the sensory information for every sensory pathway comes in through the first order neuron. The first order neuron shares the same pathway, its cell body is in the same dorsal root ganglion, and then from the second order neuron and onwards, the pathways then separate from each other, which we will discuss in much more detail in the subsequent pathways on the individual sensory tracts. So I hope you benefited from the lecture. If yes, then please do like the video and don't forget to subscribe the channel. Bye for now.